Italy? Whiskey? Ah, Italy, you could never unlock my secret. Oh no! Suddenly, no, leave me! Let's begin. Indeed.
Okay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. My name is Brian, and this is the Fireside Chat. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Naomi Murphy. According to what I looked into, you're a clinical psychologist and therapist, and you appear to have a particular interest in trauma-focused services. So welcome to the show, Naomi.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me on. Really great to have the chance to chat with you.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing about your work and stuff. So, I guess like the reason why I became interested was because I saw that you were kind of advocating for a very well-known convict. I don't know how else to describe it. Bronson, Charles Bronson, not his real name, but you know, and I was interested in that because I had watched the film, and I think that at least your angle is really unique. So first I wanted to ask like why do you do that? What's that about?
Well, I think we have a lot of stereotypes about people in the justice system, and I think there's a lot of conversations that we don't have about things that are really important. So, I mean, probably worth me saying, I've never met Charles Bronson and have not researched Charles Bronson. But what I do have is a background of working in the high secure prison estates within the UK. And many of them, I worked in a very specialist mental health service, and many of the men that came to us from long-term segregation or closed supervision centres, which is the kind of environment Mr. Bronson's in. And I think the UK prison system, they would really like to shut down segregation units, and I think that's a really commendable aim. But the reality is sometimes it's functional for people to be in prison, and sometimes it's functional for people to be in the most restrictive part of the prison system. And I suppose that's what I was wanting to highlight. I think it's very easy to think, who would want to be in prison? Everyone wants to be outside, but actually there are people who do get some reward out of being in prison, even though it might seem really crazy and screwed up.
Oh, yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. It's like, especially if you've been in it for a while, it becomes your world. So, like it's your community, it's your family, whatever. And so, yeah, I can see that totally. What made you interested in, because, you decided to become a psychologist, but why this particular subject? Is it because maybe you just find it more interesting, or is it underserved? Because most people would just be therapists for, like middle class wine moms or something. So why this?
It's a really good question, and I think there's obviously a part of me that likes a challenge. So I suppose I've made my living really working with people who probably weren't that easy to connect with, because I think a lot of mental health services are provided by white middle class women, and that isn't necessarily all that appealing, and that does mean that there are big sections of the population that are very underserved, and typically they're people that perhaps are in most need of services. So like in the UK, it's if you need short-term work, it's very easy to access, well, not very easy, but it's easier to access that via our health service. But if you have more complex problems, if you have difficulties trusting in authority figures, then it becomes harder. If you have any kind of addictive issues, if you've been involved in crime, all signs that somebody might perhaps have more pain to deal with, be a bit more, find it harder to cope with everyday life. To me, they're people who actually need the service more, but it's very difficult for them to access it. And so I suppose partly I enjoy a challenge, and I suppose morally I've always felt like we should be doing. I've got a very strong sense of social justice, and I've always felt like we shouldn't be just eliminating or forgetting about people that don't fit with the rest of society. I think it's, you know, we ought to be trying to be inclusive and trying to include people in society. And I think if you put people outside society, then they have no stake in it. So it's not surprising then that people end up breaking rules because they see the rules as not applying to them.
Yeah, and so that is very true. Does the NHS cover any like therapeutic or psychological help? Or because I know that, you know, a lot of these people we're talking about, they don't have a lot of resources. They probably also don't think that, you know, anyone wants to help them, you know. So does the NHS help with that at all?
It does, but so it does include mental health services. But I suppose one of the things that's commonly spoken about is how poorly funded and supported mental health services are compared to physical health services. And then the more complex your needs, you know, the people. So I worked for the NHS when I was working in a prison. And people were coming and they were having 5 years of treatment, which sounds like absolutely loads. But of course, if you've spent your whole lifetime, you know, very traumatized on the back of your childhood, and then you've had further very difficult experiences during childhood, you've had years of reinforcement of certain ways of relating to other people. So you've got a lot of work to do, and it's very difficult to access that. So there was concern in the UK justice system about people who were prevented from accessing any treatment. So there was a big investment, which is why we had the luxury of being able to do this. But of course, you know, there's lots of barriers to getting mental health treatment. People don't necessarily recognise that they need it, or people don't feel a big problem is people don't feel they deserve it. So certainly in prison, that's what I encountered, is that people didn't feel they were good enough for anyone to invest in them. They'd never had that kind of attention or felt that people genuinely cared about them. If your own parents don't care about you, why would a paid professional care about you? So it could, all those sorts of things act as barriers to reaching out for help.
Yeah. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that people who end up as a part of the sort of, you know, criminal prison system are people that like have been basically in many cases abandoned, which we're going to get into. So once you've started doing this work, what did you learn that maybe, like, you know, you didn't know before about the nature of these convicts, of these guys in the, and also tell us a little bit about like how, I guess, like how far they would go. You know, it wasn't just tax evasion. We're talking about violent felons, right?
Yeah, we're talking about people who they had to be in to get admitted to the unit that I worked in. They had to have committed a very serious violent or sexually violent crime. So the vast majority of people were there for murder or rape, very serious physical assaults whereby the victim might not have died but had a very serious beating, and they had to be considered at risk of committing a further similar kind of offence. They had to also have been excluded from any other treatment programme within the UK prison system. And most of them, there's something called the Hare's psychopathy checklist, which measures if you're a psychopath. And so most of them would have been described as being untreatable psychopaths to come into, I don't like that word, but that has some meaning for some people. So that's the kind of individuals we were working with. If you weren't a physical risk of harm to other people, you wouldn't have come to our service, because we would be too expensive to warrant that level of investment.
Wow. So what what did you find, like, working with these men that maybe, like, I don't know, altered your assumptions or something,
Yeah, that's a really nice question, and not something that probably gets asked enough of clinicians. So it's really good question. And just to qualify, before I went to work there, I had worked in a mental health in-reach team before, which was about diverting mentally ill people from prison to hospital. And I'd also worked in a secure hospital, medium secure hospital. What I found, one of the things that was surprising was how frightened the men were of us. So, you'd read in the file about the person's offending, and you'd think, oh my gosh, this person sounds like a monster. Is it going to be safe to sit in a room on my own with them? And actually, you'd go and introduce yourself to make an appointment, and you could see their faces literally drain of colour. In terms of they were frightened of female authority figures quite often.
So these men were more afraid of you than maybe you were of them.
Yes, and I have to say, over time, I've learned that the more macho a man looks, quite often that's hiding fear and vulnerability. If you're secure and confident in yourself, you don't need to pump yourself up to make yourself big. A lot of the men have that typical, like an inverted triangle with big shoulders, skinny legs, where they spent all their time making themselves look big and bulky. And my experience is those kind of men in prison are generally they're anxious, they're frightened, but they put a lot of effort into concealing their fear. So I could go and meet a man who's 6 foot odd, 6'2", I'm 5'9", and I could see, so physically he could have easily overpowered me, but I could see that he'd be very frightened. So I suppose that was one aspect. Many of the men were in there because they'd offended against women, but actually when you start understanding their histories, mostly they'd been abused by both men and women in all senses of the word. But one of the things that really surprised me was we did a kind of audit of their histories, and 66% of them had been sexually abused, and usually on multiple occasions by multiple perpetrators. But the thing that was really interesting was 52% had been abused by a woman on at least one occasion. So we're talking about people as little boys who were abused by big sisters, babysitters, mums' friends, aunts. So the same kind of stories that you would hear if you were working with a female prisoner population. So people talk a lot about women in prison have a history of trauma. And with men, the standard dialogue is, some of them have been abused. Well, I've worked in prisons for over 20 years, and I haven't met the man in prison who didn't have an abusive upbringing. And I would say, in general, the more abhorrent the crime, the more brutality the person experienced during childhood. And in a low secure environment, you're probably talking maybe about 1 or 2 perpetrators of harm when they were children. But when you've got men in the high secure estate, quite often they've been abused by most people who came into contact with them. So I think the amounts of abuse by women, and especially sexual abuse by women, was quite shocking. And then I suppose another factor that I think people would find quite shocking was when they first start treatment, they're all loners, they're all tough, they don't need anybody else, they're very hostile, they're very aggressive. They were kind of like they had to sign up to group treatment as well as individual therapy. Individual therapy, their levels of attendance were really high, and it's very easy to avoid treatment. Even in prison, you can arrange to get yourself down to work. You could just not bother turning up. There were no consequences, no sanctions if you didn't come for therapy, but the men came for their therapy. So within the sort of first couple of months of being in treatment, they'd be attending every session, and that was much better than you'd get within a community sample, for instance. But in the groups, to start off with, there'd be a lot of hostility towards one another, a lot of hostility aimed at the therapists. But by year 3 of treatment, the men would be crying in the group, and they'd be saying, this is the first time in my life I've ever felt loved and cared for, which is really heartbreaking if you think that somebody has to end up being a 40-odd-year-old man in prison, having done something awful, ruined somebody else's life, ruined their own life, to have that experience of feeling cared for. And I think that was that was very striking, but also it was very moving. You'd see real moments of compassion and connection between the men. So these are people who, you know, we all see the prison documentaries on TV and you see how frightening it is. You can almost smell the fear emanating out of the TV set. And yet I've also seen these moments of like real compassion, love within prison, real care and concern. And that's also very touching. And we don't tend to see that so much.
Oh no, that's actually really interesting that these men, you know, these like we sort of characterize them as hardened criminals that, you know, have no like regard for humanity, and probably because of their abuse, because we've talked about this on our show too, and it's nice to hear it, you know, sort of confirmed that in the United States, you know, like something like 95% of violent offenders have experienced like child abuse or sexual abuse, and again, a shocking number of the abusers, when their children are women, in their lives, like you said, caretakers, you know, relatives, teachers, whatever. And that's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. So why do you think it is that like most people would be shocked to hear this information? Why aren't we talking about the, I guess, we're aware of men's capacity to abuse, right? This is sort of like standard. Everyone knows. In fact, we presume it in many cases without, you know, actually like confronting that. And so that's one of the things we talk about on our show, because we discuss the issues faced by men. But half of that equation is talking about the ways that women can also contribute to that. It's like a cycle of violence, right? It's generational. So why do you think nobody wants to talk about that or knows about that?
I don't know. It's a tough one, because sometimes, you know, it beggars belief. And I think that, you know, women are capable of doing all of the same awful things that men are capable of doing. I think we perhaps don't do it in the same numbers or proportions, but without a doubt, women are capable of doing all of the same things that men do. And actually, women can hide behind because, you know, people will accept women's violence, women's sexual abuse in a way that they wouldn't. We look to see women and girls as victims. We don't look to see men and boys as victims, do we? And so women are excused. If a woman slaps her husband, that's dismissed as not being as important because the woman's less strong. But I think there is something about, we do seem to value female life more than we value male life. And I guess from a evolutionary perspective, that makes sense, because, you know, it takes so long for the woman to carry the child. So you have to think that evolution is part of that. But then I also think women, they kind of like the way that women organize themselves is quite often to organize collectively as groups, and men seem to do that less. And, you know, if you think about male suicide, which is really common for men kind of like around midlife, and it seems that men at that phase of their life are less likely to have friends to be able to engage with and talk to, whereas women maintain their relationships and their social networks throughout their life, and so have more support. And I don't know whether that is part of what makes a difference, that, you know, women can therefore stick together. But there's a tendency, I think, to monopolize a position of women as victim, and actually don't think it necessarily does women favors all the time. You know, if women want equality, then equality isn't about saying, well, we're only ever hapless victims. Sadly, equality does also mean that women are accepting that women can also do some of the other unpleasant things that men do, which we don't seem to want to recognize. I can't think. I mean, I just don't know. Is the answer? But
yeah, I think that
it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Basically, like, you know, it part of it is our biology. Part of it is there is a social stigma against being critical of bad female behavior because there is this presumption that you're making a generalization about all women. But I think that if people are interested in, I guess, some kind of equality, I think that also has to come with accountability. So when you have bad actors, you have to treat them like bad actors, right? And if we're going to follow the same sort of like, logic of observing patterns in bad male behavior, then it probably is the same for bad female behavior, right? So have you ever heard of a woman named Erin Pitsey?
Yes, yes,
She,
yes,
yeah.
I have. Yeah.
So she's a friend of ours,
Uh-huh.
and in case the audience isn't aware, I'm sure that most of our audience is, but she started the very first women's shelter in Britain in the 1960s, late 60s. And at first it was, like a highly celebrated thing. But as she was working with these women who were coming from abusive relationships and they bring their children with them and all that to live in the shelter, she noticed that the women were were as violent towards their children as the men might have been to them. And so and then when she looked into their history, she found out that, as children, they were abused by their parents. And so like, up for her trouble, she was like essentially driven out, and I think they killed her dog or something. But but she was trying to like bring attention to this, because if we want to, in my opinion, if you want to try to at least minimize the cycle of violence, we have to be able to trace it, and that means we have to have uncomfortable conversations. So
Absolutely. I don't know if I don't know whether you've encountered Liz Bates at all or Deborah Powney. So I host a podcast, Locked Up Living, and we've had both of them on talking again about women's violence against men in domestic situations and male victims of violence, and you hear the same kind of story. But what's really difficult is actually, if a woman's voicing that they've been the victim, there's a greater willingness to believe her. So for men, it's as if their victimization gets compounded in some way by this need to silence this conversation. I guess resources probably plays into it as well, in terms of if there's a finite pool of resources available, then are women-only organisations guilty of holding on to those? And I think the other factor that plays a part actually is class, or certainly within the UK, I believe class plays a part. So this idea that this idea that men hold the majority of the power, and well, that's true if you're looking at the kind of like the middle classes and the people making decisions in Parliament. So, there's a lot more men. But actually, if you're talking about day-to-day interactions, the average man might not have significantly more power than the average woman. So I think class has been a bit of a confounding variable when it comes to how we talk about gender.
yeah, absolutely. And also, even the men in high positions in government, they act in they usually make decisions for the benefit of women. Like there are no men that are saying, we're going to do all this for men like that, because it wouldn't fly. It would make people upset. So instead, especially with politicians, they get elected based on their ability to appeal to women. So it's not just about who holds the position, but who is that person serving. And also, there are far more men at the very bottom, of society, like the homeless and the criminals, right? The people who aren't cared for. So getting back to the men for a minute. So how do you get a man like a convict, a violent psychopath? How do you get them to open up to you? Because it seems like that would be just a monumentous task. So how do you do it?
It does, and it could take a long time. I mean, it could take the best part of 12 months to really build a relationship, but people would really end up feeling very differently about therapy once they'd got into it. And I suppose, firstly, by acknowledging the reason behind, the rationality behind their difficulties trusting people. If you've been harmed by anyone who should have been looking after you in childhood, of course you're skeptical and cynical about this person who's turning up offering you therapy. Of course you don't trust. So acknowledging the normality of not trusting and making that okay. Also letting them know that you can see through that fear. So, you know, there's something about giving different responses, and the prison officers, when we first started working there, were quite shocked by, I think they thought we were probably soft touchers because we weren't wanting to get a kit on and get somebody taken down to segregation. If somebody was aggressive, we would want to be having conversations about what the consequences of that were for the interpersonal interaction. So we'd be talking about the fact that, you know, if you're putting all this energy into looking scary, that suggests you're probably a little bit frightened, and there's probably a little boy part of you that was frightened, that was hurt. And actually, because that is so much part of people's experiences, that becomes a bit irresistible, that people are able to acknowledge, actually, there is this hurt part. I think we all want connection. And so even though we might be saying, F you, and, you know, I don't want anything to do with you, the reality is people are looking for those little glimpses that you might be somebody different, that you might be somebody that can be trusted. And people would end up developing very strong attachments to their therapists because they felt that this was somebody who for the first time saw them as a real human being and didn't just fall for their, you know, I suppose a lot of people who end up in prison for violence are people who've been acting out as teenagers, you know, would have been seen as being antisocial or delinquent. The school would have tried to get rid of them, you know, get them expelled. Whereas we'd be saying, look, we need to find a way to have a connection with this person. We need to break through that. And they would see that there was some wish to have a relationship with them. So what would happen at the start of treatment was sometimes men wouldn't come. They would, and they'd think that you're not going to stay in the room, you're not going to turn up, you'll suggest that we move them on to a different project, that they don't belong there. But actually we would turn up week after week, and, you know, then the other prisoners would be saying to them, well, that person sat up there in that room waiting for your session, why haven't you gone? You're wasting their time. And eventually, you know, the penny sinks in that actually maybe this person is going to stick around, even if I try my hardest to push them away. So it's about throwing people a curved ball. They think they know you, and they think that if they say F off, you're going to say, you know, F you back. And, you know, if you don't do that, if you say, well, okay, I appreciate you're really angry with me right now, or you don't trust me, then it allows the conversation to go to in a different direction.
So you kind of like, instead of simply responding to their, you know, their rage, which they're, you know, on some level it's justified, you basically just keep them talking, you know, and after a while they'll soften. And you said it could take up to like 12 months. So this makes me wonder about our prison system in general. Do you think that the prison system makes, because I mean, I believe that it does, but do you believe that it makes things worse in some ways? Because, you know, you have, like, say a man, well, I guess I can look at the Charlie Bronson case, right? So apparently he went to jail for armed robbery. And from that point, it was just, you know, a snowball. Like, it just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And part of it, I think, might be the culture of prisons themselves, not just the other inmates, but the guards and the isolation, etc. Do you think that is a contributing factor?
I personally don't think prison works. I think there are some people who are so dangerous they obviously need to be in prison, but that isn't the majority of people in prison. The vast majority of people are not a danger to the public.
Right. So what you're saying is it could work, but only with really extreme cases, not necessarily like, you know, lesser felonies. Is that what you're saying, kind of?
I don't know. I'm not sure what you. I don't think that prison works, because I think we send people to prison who are never going to get any treatment in prison. So the vast majority of people go to prison for fairly short sentences, probably not going to get any treatment at all while they're in there. Their disruption to, if they did have work, they've probably lost it. you've put a barrier wedge between them and their family, so maybe they've also perhaps got less social support. These are people who weren't coping well when they were outside before. You send them to prison, you've just aggravated the situation and done nothing to improve it. There are people who need to be in prison because they're so dangerous that they clearly can't be just wandering around outside, because they need some kind of intervention. But the problem is, because we send so many people to prison, we haven't got the resources to actually give them what they need while they're in prison. So, if we sent less people to prison, we could make our prisons better environments. There isn't enough of an emphasis on ultimately, in Britain at the moment, there's a lot of talk about creating trauma-informed environments. Well, being trauma-informed means that people feel safe, and that's not true for the vast majority of vast parts of the British prison system, certainly. And from what I've seen on TV of American prisons, they look like very scary. You can smell the fear. Yeah. So I think, if we sent less people to prison, we could then invest more in creating communities where people felt safe, felt included, and where you could actually get to grips with the root of what some of their problems are. Now, there are little pockets of places like that in, excuse me, in prisons in the UK, and undoubtedly in America as well. The Work's a fantastic film if you've not seen that, which is in an American prison. But those things happen, but they're few and far between. So people come to prison, they don't get any skills, they don't become any more at peace with themselves. If they were angry when they came in, they're still angry when they go out. Maybe they're even more angry because they feel aggrieved, as if they've been treated badly. You've put this wedge, and then now the authorities are the authority, and it's their stake in society becomes smaller and smaller the more time they spend in prison. And if you want people to abide by the rules of society, they need to feel that society is invested in them.
Yeah, I agreed 100%. So I was about to ask you this question, but I got a super chat that basically asked the question. So Duncan Alexander gives us 70, I think it's South African currency. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. And he says, at Dr. Murphy, is there anything you'd change about your job? Is there anything that you would change about your job?
Well, I'm not working there at the moment. I've moved on from working in prisons, and so working with people in private practice, including elite athletes at risk of offending. But I love being a psychologist. I love providing therapy. I wouldn't undo I've spent 25 years working with people who offend, and I wouldn't change any of that at all. I think the system's quite hard and quite brutal, and I think you need really good relationships with colleagues, and have to put an awful lot of effort into your own well-being to manage the work, because it's quite brutal in terms of the impact on staff. But no, I wouldn't. Thank you for the question, but I wouldn't change having done that job at all. I loved it.
What was your favorite thing about that job when you were working with these male convicts?
I think I'm quite an emotional person, and I loved the ability to work in a way that's emotionally authentic, and also the fact that you'd be exposed to all different sorts of emotions. So, I have felt very frightened at work on occasion, but equally I felt really moved with joy, or felt very touched, feelings of appreciation and love for fellow mankind. So that goes alongside the fear, and I felt hated, but also I've felt people's investment in me as a person. And I think the work's never dull or boring. No 2 days would be the same. And I think I learned a lot about human nature from being in prison, in a way that you don't have if you're just functioning and working alongside people who are exactly the same as you, with very similar experiences to you. It's nice to have been exposed to different stories. I wish sometimes there was less sadness about it. It shocks me, even after 25 years, how bad, you could still hear a story and think, oh my God, I thought I'd heard the worst ever, and I'm still hearing this. But I also think I've seen the good in people as well by doing that job.
And so you believe that you see the good in these men, that they could have been murderers and or rapists, but they're just really broken. Is that your, or they're damaged?
Yeah, I don't believe that there is anyone who, I mean, I hate the word evil when that gets used, and that often will get used because of someone's crime. And obviously, I've seen people who've done really, really disturbed, very abhorrent crimes, but there is always some humanity to the person. And I think we don't put enough effort into trying to see the humanity. And it's like that humanity might be a tiny little flame that needs fanning to become a proper fire. And I think too often we spend all our time trying to squash the person, and rather than trying to allow that to happen. I'm not naive, I'm able to see when somebody's very dangerous. And like I say, there are people who probably will need to spend all of their life in prison. But I don't think we do enough to help fan the humanity and the goodness and compassion that is in people, and see really kind actions in prison sometimes. And yet that's not what gets spoken about. We speak about the hypermasculine, the dangerousness, depict people as always kind of like assaulting and raping each other in prison, when there are these moments that are also really touching.
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna ask you about prison rape, trying to figure out how to broach the subject, because in the States at least, it's the most prevalent kind of rape. So most people think of rape and they think, a man grabbing a woman in the middle of the night, dragging her down an alley, tearing her clothes off. But first of all, those are extremely rare cases. But on top of that, the most common is prison rape. And what I was wondering about, maybe you don't know, but I guess that you do, um, is this something that continue, like sort of adds to their rage and fear and trauma, or do they somehow, do they just sort of normalize that in because it's prison?
I think it's a good question. When I've read about this before, the suggestion is that it's not as common in the UK as it is in America. So whether it gets used as a kind of like a means of power and brutality within this, whether that's been normalized as a way of expressing power within the American system more than in the UK system. But I'm not naive enough to think that it doesn't happen. And I think there are people who are vulnerable to that. I think there are also people who also sell themselves sexually in order to survive prison, whether that be because they're frightened and want protection, or whether it's because they're short of resources and want money for vaping, it would be now, rather than cigarettes. But so I don't think it's as common, and I don't think we know enough about it within the British system, certainly. But obviously it will be something that happens because you've got a population that includes men who pose a sexual risk to others anyway.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, uh, one of the reasons why I talk a little bit about prison rape is firstly because statistically it's really high, but the other thing is, at least compared to other rape. But the other thing is that it sort of like feeds more into the critique of the prison system in general, because the way I see it, if you commit a crime and you go to jail or go to prison for it, the prison, the separation from the wider society, like you're being taken out, right, of the society and been put in this cage, that is the punishment, not the rape. That's not included, right? But people are very laissez-faire, sort of, almost like they think of it as part of the punishment. So you'll get all these jokes about how you'll be treated in prison, don't drop the soap, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that it's a really bad way to look at the situation, because that shouldn't be happening in prison. And it's not about sex. It is about dominance, right? This is something that happens in the third world too, the same kind of thing. So yeah, that's what I don't know, if you want to give me some thoughts on that, but that was what I wanted to say.
No, I think that's right. I also wonder if whether there may be less opportunity within British prisons, because I don't know, but it looks as if it's normal to have quite a lot of dormitory accommodation in American prisons, and that isn't the norm in British prisons. So
Yeah.
normally somebody would be in a cell with one other or two other people. So we're talking about very restricted spaces, and obviously if you're in a cell with somebody who is inclined to abuse you in that way, then you would be very, very vulnerable. But I wonder whether that might account for why there might be a bit less of it. But certainly I think there's an element of power, and then also I've heard of people talking about that as that's not really gay sex if you rape somebody when you're in prison, because that's just being a man, and men have this need. That's how I've heard
no,
it.
I've heard that too, and again, like it's the same thing in the third world. Like there's the same kind of things happen where essentially the argument is if I'm on top, then it's not gay. So which is a strange thing, but what are you gonna do? Have you ever legitimately been afraid, like of an inmate or a person that you were working with?
Yes, I have. And do you know what? If anyone says that they've worked in a prison and they say they've never been frightened, then they're lying to themselves, if not you. Prisons
Yeah.
are frightening places. It's not normal to walk around amongst, 20 or 30 men who've all murdered and raped and not be scared. And if one of them's kicking off because it's losing his temper and shouting and swearing, then it's not normal to not feel frightened under those circumstances. And when you know what people have done and what they're capable of at their worst, when they're in a fit of rage, if they're kicking off and they're angry, of course you're scared. So I think we do all sorts of things psychologically to help ourselves cope with that when we're in prison. So I've heard lots of people say, oh, I've never felt, I've worked in prison for 40 years, I've never felt scared. And I think, well, it's a bit like crossing the road. If I say to you, are you frightened when you cross the road? Most people say, no, of course I'm not. It's like, well, you are, because you look left or right. If you really weren't scared, you'd just walk straight across the road. Well, the fact you've looked left and right it's a safety behavior, so it enables you to cross the road. And people do that same sort of thing in prison. So they say to themselves, well, there's an officer outside the room, there's a panic button on the wall. But certainly I think if you acknowledge that you're frightened, and we would have that discussion with prisoners. We'd say, you're behaving in a way that's really frightening right now. It doesn't mean I'm going to change what I'm going to do. I'm not going to back down or run away, but actually you're behaving in a way that's frightening. They don't always know that they're behaving in a way that's frightening, for starters. They don't necessarily recognize that they're being aggressive because they're shouting at you. So acknowledging that, I think, is useful. But also, if you don't acknowledge it, you can find you're finding ways to placate somebody when actually they really need to be confronted by that. And my experience of prisons is they spend a lot of time keeping the staff who run the prisons safe, rather than thinking about what happens when the person's released. And actually, so for instance, we used to get a lot of men who would have stamped on their file not to be left alone with a woman, and they'd committed, say, a number of rapes outside. Well, we'd say that person needs to be working with a woman, else they're not going to address their dangerousness. If they only ever work with a man, then they're not going to. That's whatever it is that gets evoked in situations with women isn't going to get evoked. So obviously we'd have in place measures to make sure the female staff member was kept safe, but ultimately we would see that there would need to be a relationship between the prisoner and the female staff members, and that just doesn't happen in prison ordinarily. So it's kind of like you're expected to come to prison, leave your offending behaviour at the gate, and then pick it up on your way back out again. So if you've got prisons that are very sterile environments, you see the same actually in services for female victims. Quite often, I went to a hospital in Canada, in Saskatoon, where they had a service for women, and all of the staff were female apart from the psychiatrist. So the most powerful staff member was male because they couldn't get a female psychiatrist. But what you're saying to those women is men are dangerous. Actually, if you're treating female survivors of male abuse, then those women need to develop relationships with men and learn that men can be safe, they can be caring, not all men are dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And the same would go for men in prison. So unless you start noticing when you feel frightened and what that might be about, it stops you from really getting to the root of what people's problems are.
Yeah. So earlier we were talking about what these men are like, in what they're lacking, like what they're not getting, which is essentially, communication and bonding, connecting with other people, because human beings need that. Like, we'll go crazy without it. Do you know if some of the men that you've helped have sort of tried to develop, let's say, I don't want to say community, but if they tried to bond with you or other therapists or other prisoners, even if there's has been work done, do you think that that's good to do that with other inmates?
What do you mean? Sorry.
To sort of I think that one of the issues with many men in general is that they want to do everything on their own, and part of it probably has something to do with early life experience. So they're not great at making friends, and I think that the need for us to have friends is absolutely crucial. It's understated. We often talk about family and everything, and all that's important, but they need their own little network. And what I'm wondering is, I don't even know if there's an opportunity for this in the current prison system, but do you think that some of these men that you have helped have gone on to do that, maybe with their therapist, maybe with a prison guard, maybe whatever, right?
Certainly, the men that we worked with would tend to kind of start talking about staff as if they were like parents, the way that they related to them. And they would also start opening up to other men. So what most of them had, they would all have individual therapy, and then they were all in a number of groups, and the same group of 8 men that they would be in for everything. And they would usually use their sessions with their individual therapist to practice talking about something. So they would share something about how their dad had treated them, for argument's sake. And then I think when they found that, the therapist didn't shame me for talking about this, they would then go and share it in the larger group, and the men would spend a lot of time outside of the group talking about the kind of experiences that they were talking about in therapy. So that would allow work to be progressed. So they were sharing really deep, very painful accounts with people who other people would be quite frightened of, but they were connecting over this. And it was really, like I say, that was one of the elements. It was really powerful, very beautiful part of the work.
Do you have any I don't know how much you can disclose, because I know that these are often very private conversations, but do you have any particular success story that from this, maybe that you're particularly glad that you were there for or experienced?
I think I can't talk about any individual details, but I suppose a number of them. We worked with people who, so in Britain, in the UK, if you get a life sentence, it's not whole life. It's a nominal term that you have to serve. So, for instance, you might get 12 years, and that's the minimum amount of time that you'd have to serve before you could be even considered for release. Many of the men that we worked with had committed particularly abhorrent crimes, and so their sentence might be 20 years. But when they came to us, they'd often served way over that initial tariff, and they were still nowhere near getting out. They were still classified as being the highest risk of prisoner. And as I say, many of them had come from living in segregation for a long time, and these people managed to make progress.
Really quick, I'm sorry. Yeah, something happened with my internet. It's a little windy So they might knock down the wire. I hope they don't, but they might. Okay, so what I was saying is, let me see if I can remember. Oh yeah, so when you say segregation, right? Is that like what we call solitary confinement, which is basically like, okay, so it's basically just like a black box and it's dark, you're alone, and you could be in there for months. So,
Well, they do have a window, but they don't have proper furniture. They have furniture that, so they can't hurt themselves. They don't have very little other stuff in there, and it's intended to be used for like a few days. But obviously, there are people who engineer being in there for a very long time. Being in, and you only come out for like an hour a day for exercise and for your shower, whereas if you're on a normal location, you would be allowed out for a couple of, you'd probably be out for kind of like 4 or 5 hours of the day at least.
yeah,
So it's
yeah.
a lot more restrictive. And so we had, men that came to us who'd been living in those conditions for many months, who would then come to us, and then would, at the end of no one would be released straight from where we were, but they would get to move to a less secure prison. And so that was progress. And there are people who've been released now after being treated, who were really stuck in the system. So that's good to see. But also, it sounds weird, but people looked healthier. So, at the start of treatment, they'd have like really eyes out on stalks because they were so hypervigilant, because they were so frightened, be making threats all the time, be very aggressive or self-harming. That was something else that people often did. And yet, at the end of treatment, they would be able to interact like ordinary prisoners on normal location, not threatening people. They'd look calm. They'd talk about having some sense of peace of mind. And that made them less dangerous because they weren't spending all their time ruminating on how they could get back at society for forgetting about them.
Can you spot, like, I mean, this is you were talking about the bulging eyes thing. Is that like a sign of psychopathy, or are there?
Well, this particular person that I'm thinking of had paranoid personality disorder, and he was classified as being psychopathic. But I don't think you can necessarily. I think there are certain characteristics that you see that are common in prisons, and having hypervigilant eyes, having the massive torso, and wearing dark shades is quite common in prison populations as well. I think when you go into hospitals, you often see kind of like frequent changes of name, which seems to be about identity disturbance and lack of attachment to who you are at the end of the day.
Yeah. All right, I got 2 more questions, so I think we're going to be on good time here. 2 more things I'm thinking about. Number 1, in the United States, so I don't know about Britain, but in the United States, we have almost completely stopped using, like, I guess we'll call them asylums for people who are mentally ill. We have therapy and mental health centers, but what I was wondering about is because what a lot of times what we do is we just either let them, just give them some services, or depending on what they do, we'll send them to prison. And if you're, if you have like a bunch of mental health problems, I don't think prison is good. I know that there's a lot of talk about like how abusive asylums were, but do you think that we should bring those back for some people, or do you have like a different idea about that?
No, I think that mirrors kind of what happened in the UK. So they did close the old asylums, and that seems to have kind of had an impact on the prison population. So some of these people are ending up in prison instead. I think the asylums were probably also very awful institutions for people to be in. I think I think the bottom line is, if we want people to have the opportunity to heal and recover, we need to be thinking about how we help people, number one, feel safe, and how we enable them to feel there is a connection between them and society. And I think we spend too much time othering people. So, if we're sticking them in institutions and labeling them as as an offender or a patient, then somehow we make them less than the people that don't have to go to those institutions. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think I personally am much more in favour of having people work on their problems in the community. And I think in Britain at the moment, there's a bit of a trend for talking about building more prisons. Rather than spend money building prisons, I think if they should put that money into children's services, for argument's sake.
Yes. Yeah, like we can probably prevent, criminality if we did that. And also obviously like encourage families to stay together and things like that. I mean, those are no-brainers, right? That requires like no amount of litigation or political power is gonna change that. We have to change the culture, especially around child rearing. Have you we might go a little over, but that's okay. Have you talked about or taken interest in sort of like childcare that may not like result in this kind of behavior, like basically not, I don't want to say no like punishment, but maybe there's no abuse?
Yeah, well, I personally, I'm not in favour of using physical chastisement for kids. I think what kind of message, so it'd be illegal for me to slap you, but I could slap a child. Well, what message does that give us, give children about their worth?
Yeah, well, it also is saying, well, this is the best way for me to get my way. So, because your mother's trying to get her way, or your father, or whatever. So, yeah, that's the... I'm with you on that. I prefer not to spank or whatever, figure out another way.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that we don't talk enough about is poverty. And if people are struggling for resources to live, they don't have enough money to eat or to heat their homes, they're worried about losing the roof over their heads, that would bring out the worst in anybody. So it's not surprising then if there's higher levels of violence and children are treated more cruelly, if we're not enabling every member of our society to feel safe. I think it's quite disgusting that we're in such countries that are should be advanced, where there should be enough money to go around, but actually we have major sections of the population that don't have enough money just for the basic human needs to live.
All right, last question. I probably will think of more after this is over, but maybe you'll come back on sometime. This is always like really tricky, the death penalty. So first of all, do you guys have the death penalty in the UK?
No, it was outlawed many years ago, and we have had politicians recently talking about bringing it back. I'm vehemently opposed to the death penalty.
Yeah, that's the thing I was trying to that I wanted to get your input on, because we have it here, but not in every state. Some don't, some do, and it's an ongoing conversation. Like, are there people, and I mean mostly we're talking about men, who are beyond redeemable, and people don't want to pay for their existence through taxation. But yeah, what I would imagine that because you work with these guys, you think everyone has a chance, right, to turn their life around. So I would guess, is that like why you oppose the death penalty?
It is. Well, I think at basic level, there's always the ability to get it wrong, which we've seen lots of times with people and that's ultimately that was a factor in why it became outlawed within the UK, because actually there was major cases where people had been wrongfully convicted. So even on that basis alone, but yes, I don't believe that people are irredeemable. But also, what I find really fascinating is it's believing in the death penalty is quite often. I mean, it's interesting religion's role in relation to the death penalty, because I think you see really amazing work by religious people being compassionate towards people in prison, but also you see really religious people using their religion to almost justify the death penalty. And certainly think if you believe in God, I don't think there's a place for making judgment on other people. I think personally, then surely that's a decision for God to take away their life, not
Yeah.
our decision.
Yeah, I have spoken with people that are religious, and they're kind of split on this too. Like some people are for it and some people are against it. So you're right though. I mean, it's a really difficult thing to talk about, but one of the worst things I could imagine happening is essentially killing someone and then later learning that they're innocent, because we have like this. I mean, I guess in your case, with your experiences, many of these men are guilty of something, because like they're talking to you about it, they're opening up about it. But yeah, like the killing of innocent people or people who could be redeemed, I find that's a really tough pill to swallow. So, all right, so I got some super chats, technically the super chows, of people that want to say something to you. So first, this is from the last show we did, which was on April 1st. Idiot Boy gives us $50 and says, "What if everything we see is real and our senses were just telling us the truth for the most part?" All right, thank you, Idiot Boy. Then we got a $10 donation from Anonymous about today's show. They say, "Don't want to be sending this, but listen to an after show, where Brian Hanna and Dr. Randomcam couldn't express why democracy wasn't working." This is kind of off topic, I'm sorry. "Frustrating as hell to hear that. Constitutionalism is why. They're all highly intelligent. Why don't people remember that?" Well, I don't think, just for the record, the United States is not a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. And that's what I think the problem is that we're using the wrong words to describe it. People who think they're the only ones to see the truth are usually plain crazy. So I don't know. Maybe I'm like a Hopkins in the film Proof. But it's why I think that although the MRM is overall correct, the first step in fixing it will probably be the constitutionalism angle. Oh, what the hell, just take the $10 and forget my ramblings. All right, thank you, anonymous person. And then we got another anonymous, and I think this will actually be relevant. My brother went to prison. He had a schizophrenic episode that landed him there. He's not a violent person, had zero history of violence, and he's mostly quiet. But when he came out, it changed him. He became more hateful and wanted to harm the prosecutors, prison guards, and nurses. They treated him like shit, and I believe the trauma changed him. I believe this is by design by the prison system, police, judges, and politicians. I think the trauma makes people violent and throws them in despair. It makes their life more difficult and resort to crime because they have a history. We need to abolish the current system and rebuild. I think we should be like Finland and actually try to rehabilitate people instead of torturing them." So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly. I would agree that I think we should be copying the Scandinavian countries, who seem to do a much better job. Britain doesn't do much better than America. We know that prison is traumatizing for some people, and certainly I would rather see models built on the Scandinavian kind of products than ours.
In the Scandinavian model, for people who might not know, like, how is it different?
There's much more a sense of compassion and trying to build communities and trying to involve people in taking personal responsibility rather than just focusing on punishment. And they put effort into building communities where they can cook together, have something that resembles normal life, and so apply the skills that they're learning in there. But of course, we're also talking about systems where many fewer people are sent to prison, so they're not having to deal with the same numbers.
Yeah, that's true. And I think I know that, like, in the US, we've added this where people get, they learn skills, they get educated, stuff like that. But I understand that in those countries like Finland, they're they're basically trying to give these prisoners a future, or at least a path to something that is constructive, so that when they get out, they have, you know, and I think they actually help them find jobs and everything, and not just like, you know, like whatever they could, like whatever they have the ability to reach to get to. So yeah, I think that is definitely something we should be talking about instead of bringing back prisons and the death penalty and stuff like that. So
100%.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to close out the show here. I want to thank Dr. Naomi Murphy. Do you have any final words or anything you wanted to say before I close it off?
No, just really enjoyed the conversation. It's really nice to talk to somebody who's kind of like on the same page about these things. So yeah, really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, very cool. And just so people will know, where can they find you? I put your Twitter on the page there, so people can follow you on Twitter. But like, where are some other places you might send folks? I'm also on
LinkedIn, Naomi Murphy Psychologist on LinkedIn, and I have my own website, octopuspsychology.com.
All right, so go ahead and check that out, guys, if you are interested. I thought this was a fascinating conversation. It's something that I don't think anyone talks about enough. And I think that, you know, it's also had an effect on my opinions on things too. So thank you so much, Dr. Naomi Murphy. And I want to thank you guys for joining us. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you guys think about what we talked about. Do you have any experience in prison? Have you been in prison perhaps, or know somebody who has, or anything like that? And what are your thoughts on that, and how it may, you know, or may not contribute to the male behavior? This is about, we're talking about men. That's the thing I'm most interested in. And yeah, so anyway, just let us know what you guys think. If you guys like this video, please hit like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, hit the bell for notifications so you know when our shows go live. Leave us a comment, like I said before, and please share this video, because sharing is caring, and I want to like try to get the word out. And the best way to do it, if you can't help us financially, is to share the video and like the video. So thank you guys so much for coming on today's episode of the Fireside Chat, and we will talk to you all in the next video.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.